After my husband died, I spent 2 years paying $500 a month for rent on our house. But one day the bank called. "Ma'am, this house has been in your name for 10 years. You owe nothing." When I asked where my money had been going all this time, they went silent on the other end. Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video, and also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. The house on Elmwood Drive had always smelled like fresh coffee and cut grass. Tom was particular about both. He brewed a full pot every morning at 6:15, and he mowed the lawn every Saturday before the neighborhood kids were even out of bed. For 28 years, that smell was my alarm clock, my comfort, my definition of home. We bought the house in 1994, the year after our daughter Emma was born. Tom had insisted on the big backyard because he'd grown up in a cramped apartment in Cleveland and swore his child would have somewhere to run. I'd insisted on the bay window in the kitchen because I wanted to watch the seasons change without having to go outside. We compromised, as we always did, and we signed the papers on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in September, holding hands over the closing documents while Emma slept in her car seat 3 feet away. I tell you all of this because you need to understand what I had before I tell you what I nearly lost. Tom died on a Wednesday in March, a heart attack, sudden and merciless, while he was loading groceries into the car outside of Kroger. He was 61 years old. The paramedics said he likely felt nothing, that it was over in seconds. I've held on to that fact like a life preserver ever since. I've had to. The weeks after his funeral are still blurry to me. I remember casseroles on the porch. I remember Emma sleeping in the guest room because neither of us wanted to be alone. I remember sitting in Tom's armchair at 2 in the morning, unable to sleep, unable to watch television, unable to do anything but breathe and wait for the grief to soften even slightly. It was in that state, raw, disoriented, barely functional, that the phone call came. It was 5 weeks after the funeral. A man called my cell, and he introduced himself as David Harlow from Horizon Property Management. His voice was professional, a little clipped, the kind of voice that belongs to someone used to delivering administrative news. He told me he was calling regarding the property at 4412 Elmwood Drive. "We handle the property management for the Carter Family Real Estate Trust," he said. "We've been trying to reach you. As the surviving spouse, you're entitled to continue residing in the property, but the monthly maintenance fee of $500 will now be billed directly to you." I remember how I felt in that moment. Not suspicious, not alarmed, just exhausted and confused, the way grief makes everything confusing. "I didn't know there was a trust," I said. "Tom set it up through his family in 2012, the man said, smooth and unhurried. "It's fairly common for property held in joint family arrangements. We have all the documentation on file. I can mail you a summary packet." Tom had never mentioned a family trust, but Tom had handled our finances, not because I couldn't, but because he'd like to, and because we'd fallen into that pattern the way married couples fall into all patterns, slowly and without noticing. And now Tom was gone, and there was so much paperwork, so many accounts and policies and subscriptions and obligations I hadn't fully known about. Was it so strange that there might be one more? "How do I pay?" I asked. I wish I had asked different questions. I wish I had asked for the trust documents. I wish I had asked for a callback number and then called my lawyer before I did anything else. I wish I had done 100 things differently. But grief doesn't make you clever. Grief makes you compliant. Grief makes you want the list of problems to get shorter, not longer, and a $500 monthly payment felt, in that foggy moment, like a manageable problem. Something I could simply handle and move on. So I set up a recurring bank transfer that same week. For 2 years, $500 left my account on the 15th of every month. I barely noticed it after the first few months. It had become part of the quiet machinery of my survival, like the electricity bill or the water bill, one of the unremarkable costs of continuing to exist. Tom's brother Randy and his wife Diana called occasionally, warm and sympathetic, asking how I was holding up, reminding me I was family and not to hesitate to reach out. I appreciated them. I trusted them. They had been at the funeral. They had cried. Isn't that the most devastating part? That the people who stole from me cried at my husband's grave? The call from the bank came on a Thursday morning in April, 2 years and 1 month after David Harlow had first spoken to me. I was sitting at the bay window with my coffee when my phone rang and a woman from First Federal said she was following up on a home equity inquiry I'd submitted. "I just want to confirm," she said, "you understand that as the sole title holder on the property at 4412 Elmwood Drive, you have full borrowing rights against the equity. The home has been in your name for 10 years, Mrs. Carter. There's no lien, no trust encumbrance, no other claimant. The property is entirely yours." I set down my coffee. "I'm sorry," I said. "Did you say the home has been in my name?" "Yes, ma'am. Since 2014. You and your husband transferred it to your sole name prior to his passing." The backyard was green and bright through the window. A robin was sitting on the fence post, completely unbothered by the world. I stared at it for a long moment, the phone pressed to my ear, while something cold and slow began to move through my chest. "Ma'am," the woman said, "is everything all right?" I asked her to hold. Then I walked to Tom's old filing cabinet in the hallway, pulled out the property deed, and read my own name at the top of it. Helen Ann Carter, sole owner. I had been paying rent on my own house for 24 months, and someone had been collecting it. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table with the deed, the bank statements, and a yellow legal pad, and I did the math with a kind of mechanical precision that I think was my mind's way of protecting itself from the full weight of what I was looking at. 24 months, $500 each month, $12,000 total, wired to an account called Horizon Property Management, sent out of my savings on the 15th of every month, for 2 years. $12,000. I kept writing the number down and circling it, as though repetition might make it feel less real. It didn't. At some point after midnight, I made a pot of Tom's coffee, the dark roast he'd ordered from a small place in Vermont, which I'd kept buying out of habit long after he was gone. And I sat with it, and I let myself feel what I'd been holding at arm's length since the bank called. It wasn't just the money. The money was serious. $12,000 was real and significant, and I was angry about it. But what sat heavier was something else. Someone had seen my grief and decided to use it. Someone had calculated that I was alone, disoriented, and trusting, and had decided that made me a target. And for 2 years, they had been right. How does a person do that? How does a person look at a widow, a woman who has just buried her husband of 28 years, and think, now is the time? I turned that question over and over in my mind through the long hours of that night, and by the time the sun came up over the backyard fence, I had moved through the worst of the grief and the shock and arrived somewhere quieter and harder. I was done crying. I was done being stunned. I wanted to know exactly who had done this to me, and I wanted there to be consequences. That was the first morning I felt like myself again in 2 years. The name Horizon Property Management was the place to start. I went back through every piece of mail and every email I'd received after Tom's death, looking for anything from them. There was very little. A single printed letter on plain white paper, no letterhead, just a name and a P.O. box in Columbus, and the account information for the wire transfers. No phone number other than the one the man had called from. When I dialed it, it rang 4 times and went to a generic voicemail. Dead end for the moment. I pulled out my own bank statements going back 24 months and highlighted every transfer. Same account number, same routing number, every single time. The account name listed on the transfer records was Carter Property Solutions, LLC. Not Horizon Property Management. Carter Property Solutions. My stomach turned. Carter. Tom's family name. My family name. Our family name. I sat very still with that for a long moment, turning it over carefully, not wanting to jump ahead of myself. It could be a coincidence. There were other Carters in Ohio, in the world. But the combination, the family name, the trust language in that first phone call, the timing of it all, began assembling itself into a shape I didn't want to look at directly. I forced myself to write out what I knew. The company was called Carter Property Solutions, LLC. It had collected $12,000 from me. It had been set up specifically to receive those payments. Someone had known enough about my situation, my husband's death, my confusion, my finances, my address, to construct a convincing story about a family trust. Who in my life had all of that information? I made a list. It was not a long list. Tom's brother, Randy, had been involved in the probate process. He'd helped me understand the accounts, the insurance policies, the small investment fund. He'd sat across from me at this very kitchen table, going through Tom's papers with me, being helpful and patient and present. Randy knew our finances. Randy knew this house. Randy knew I was grieving and overwhelmed and not thinking clearly. Randy and his wife Diana lived 40 minutes away in Worthington. They had jobs, a mortgage, 2 adult kids. They were not, as far as I knew, struggling financially. But people do strange things for money, even people who don't appear to need it. I had read enough true crime to know that. I was not ready to accuse anyone yet. I needed to be careful. I needed to be certain. A wrong accusation against a family member would be damaging and irreversible, and I had no interest in being wrong. But I had every intention of finding out the truth. The first step was a lawyer, not the estate attorney who had handled Tom's probate. That was Randy's recommendation, I now realized with a fresh wave of nausea, but someone new, someone unconnected to anything. I called my friend Marilyn that morning and asked if she knew anyone, and she gave me the name of a woman named Patricia Ossie, who handled civil cases and had a reputation for being, as Marilyn put it, the kind of lawyer the other side doesn't want to see across the table. I called Patricia's office at 8:30 and left a message asking for the earliest available appointment. Then I drove to the bank. The teller directed me to a branch manager named Greg, a careful and methodical young man who pulled up my account history without comment and confirmed everything I already knew. When I explained what had happened, calmly with the legal pad in front of me, he went very quiet. He asked if I had ever authorized these transfers in writing. I showed him the letter with the P.O. box. He leaned back in his chair and said quietly that I should absolutely speak with an attorney. "Is there anything the bank can do?" I asked. "We can flag the transfers and provide documentation of every transaction to your legal counsel," he said. "If you pursue a fraud case, Those records will be critical. Fraud. He said the word so evenly as though it were just another item on a checklist. But it landed on me with full weight. Someone had committed fraud against me. Someone who knew my name, knew my house, knew my grief. I drove home with the bank documents in a folder on the passenger seat, and I thought about Tom. I thought about his coffee and his lawnmower and his handshake, and how he had always believed, absolutely and without reservation, that his family was good. I thought about how much he had trusted Randy. I thought about the way Randy had hugged me at the funeral, his voice breaking, telling me Tom had been the best man he knew. I thought, Tom, I am so sorry I didn't see it sooner. And then I thought, I see it now. Patricia Osei's office was on the 3rd floor of a building downtown, spare and organized, the kind of office where nothing was placed without intention. She was in her mid-50s with close-cropped silver hair and reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck. She listened to me for 40 minutes without interrupting, taking notes in a small leather notebook with precise, economical handwriting. When I finished, she put down her pen. "What you're describing," she said, "is wire fraud. Potentially also elder fraud, depending on how a prosecutor classifies it, though you're not elderly, so that may not apply. The key elements are a false representation, made intentionally, that caused you to transfer money you wouldn't otherwise have transferred. You have that. I need to know who registered Carter Property Solutions, LLC, I said. That's public information, she said. Ohio Secretary of State database. We can pull it right now. She turned to her computer. I watched her type. The room was very quiet. Outside the window, Columbus traffic moved in its ordinary, indifferent way, and it struck me how strange it was that the world simply continued. Buses and pedestrians and cloud shadows moving across buildings, while I sat in this office waiting to find out if my brother-in-law had stolen $12,000 from me. Patricia turned her monitor slightly so I could see it. Carter Property Solutions, LLC, registered in Franklin County, Ohio in April, the intern, 2 months after Tom's funeral. Registered agent and sole member, Randall Eugene Carter. Randy. I had known, I think, from the moment I saw the company name, but knowing something and seeing it documented and official and undeniable are two very different experiences. I felt the breath go out of me, and then I felt something replace it, something hard and clarifying, like stepping out of fog into cold, clean air. "That's my brother-in-law," I said. Patricia nodded once, as though she had suspected as much. "The timeline is damning," she said. "He formed the LLC specifically after your husband's death. The name was chosen to invoke family legitimacy. The Horizon property management framing on the phone call was an extra layer of misdirection. This was constructed deliberately, Mrs. Carter. This was not an impulse. Constructed deliberately." That phrase moved through me slowly like cold water. Randy had sat at my kitchen table. He had held my hands and told me Tom had loved me more than anything. He had helped me sort through Tom's papers, and while he was doing so, had he been taking notes? Had he been cataloging what I had, what I owed, what I was too confused to check? Patricia asked me to compile everything: the original letter, the wire transfer records, the Secretary of State filing, the phone number that had first called me, and to make copies of all of it. She was going to prepare a formal complaint to the Franklin County Prosecutor's Office and to the Ohio Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division. "Is that criminal?" I asked. "It will be a criminal case?" "Wire fraud is a federal crime," she said, "and in Ohio, theft by deception over $1,000 is a felony. Yes, This will be criminal. I drove home through the afternoon traffic, and I thought about what that meant for Randy, for Diane, for their kids who were in their 20s now, building their own lives. I thought about Tom, who had loved his brother, who had played baseball with him in that Cleveland apartment complex parking lot, who had asked Randy to be his best man at our wedding. I thought about how Tom would have felt, knowing what Randy had done. But here is what I kept coming back to. Randy had made a choice. He had chosen to look at me in my worst moment and to see opportunity. That choice belonged entirely to him. When I got home, I checked my email and found a message from an unfamiliar address, a Gmail account with a name I didn't recognize. The message was 3 sentences. Mrs. Carter, I hope you are doing well. I understand you've been making some inquiries. I'd like to talk before things get complicated. No name. But I knew. Randy knew I was looking. I forwarded the email to Patricia immediately, hand steady, then made a cup of coffee and sat at the bay window and watched the robin on the fence post. He'd moved first. That was a mistake. Patricia filed the complaint on a Tuesday morning in late May, and by Thursday afternoon, the detective assigned to the case, a methodical woman named Sandra Keyes from the Financial Crimes Unit, had confirmed she was opening a formal investigation. The bank records had been subpoenaed. The LLC filings were part of the file. Patricia told me in her calm and measured way that the evidence was clean, well documented, and that I should try not to worry. I was trying. What I was not expecting was Randy's response. He showed up at my door on Friday evening just before 7. He was alone, no Diane, and he looked, if I'm honest, terrible. The kind of terrible that only happens when someone has been scared for several days and hasn't slept. His eyes were red-rimmed, and his jaw was set in that particular way I recognized from Tom. Carter men clenched their jaws when they were under pressure. Helen. His voice was low, almost gentle. We need to talk. You should be talking to my attorney, I said. I had rehearsed this moment. I'd like to sort this out between family, he said, before it goes somewhere neither of us wants it to go. I didn't choose where it went, Randy. Something flickered behind his eyes. Not guilt, not quite. More like recalculation. You have no idea what Tom's finances actually looked like, he said. There are things I know about his estate that never made it into the probate records. Things that could complicate your situation considerably if they came out. There it was. I had wondered if he'd try this. Are you threatening me? I asked. I'm telling you that family histories are complicated, he said carefully, and that legal processes have a way of surfacing things that are better left buried, for everyone's sake. The threat was shapeless enough to be deniable. He'd said nothing specific, named nothing concrete. That was deliberate, I knew, but the meaning was clear. Back down, or I'll make this ugly. I looked at him standing on my porch, on the porch of my house, the house Tom and I had bought together in the rain 30 years ago, the house I had paid him $500 a month to live in, and I felt a rage so clean and so pure, it was almost peaceful. I've already spoken with a detective from the Financial Crimes Unit, I said. Her name is Sandra Keyes. If you have information relevant to Tom's estate, I suggest you share it with her. Good night, Randy. I closed the door. I stood in the hallway for a moment with my back to it, listening to the silence. Then I heard his footsteps move off the porch and his car start and the sound of him driving away. I called Patricia immediately and told her everything. The visit, the implication about Tom's finances, the veiled threat. She was not alarmed. She was, if anything, grimly satisfied. Witness tampering and intimidation, she said. Don't engage with him directly again. Document everything. If he calls or texts, forward it to me. I did not hear from Randy for the next 2 weeks. Detective Keyes called me during that time to tell me the investigation was progressing, that Randy's bank records had been obtained, and that the $12,000 in transfers had been traced through Carter Property Solutions, LLC, into Randy and Diane's joint personal account. The money had been spent: home renovations, a car payment, a vacation to Cancun, a vacation to Cancun. I had spent 2 years eating cheaper cuts of meat and skipping my annual dental checkup to manage the budget after Tom's death, and Randy had taken that money to the beach. I gave myself 3 days after I learned that. 3 days of deliberately doing nothing. I went for long walks. I called Emma, who was furious on my behalf and wanted to drive down immediately, and I told her to wait. I had Marilyn over for dinner, and we sat on the back porch until 11, the way we used to in our 30s, talking about nothing important. I let the garden go unweeded. I watched old films. I slept. I needed to be rested for what was coming. The offer arrived through Patricia, formally and in writing, on a Monday morning. Randy was proposing a private settlement. He would repay $6,000, half the total, and I would withdraw the criminal complaint. His attorney framed it as a gesture of goodwill, an acknowledgement of an administrative misunderstanding that had caused Mrs. Carter unnecessary stress. Administrative misunderstanding, as though $12,000 in fraudulent wire transfers executed through a deliberately constructed LLC over 24 months was a clerical error. I read the settlement offer twice. Then I folded it neatly in half, placed it in the folder with the rest of the documents, and called Patricia to decline. "Tell them no," I said. "The full amount plus interest plus legal fees through the proper legal channels, or nothing." There was a brief pause on the line. I imagined Patricia doing the very smallest of satisfied smiles. "Understood," she said. "I'll convey that." The truth was, I was not interested in half. I was not interested in quiet settlements that let Randy walk away from what he'd done with a reduced bill and no public consequence. I had thought about it carefully during those 3 days of rest, and I had come to a clear-eyed conclusion. What Randy had done required a formal reckoning, not because I wanted to destroy him, but because he had built what he did on the assumption that I was too weak, too grieved, and too confused to fight back. The only real answer to that assumption was to prove it wrong, completely, thoroughly, and on the record. I told Emma what had happened over a long phone call that week. She drove down on Saturday morning, which I had told her not to do, and which I was deeply grateful for. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where Randy had sorted through Tom's papers, I thought, and tried not to let that poison the moment. And she listened, and then she said, with the particular quiet intensity she'd inherited from Tom, "Mom, you're doing the right thing." That meant more to me than I can properly explain. Marilyn had known the outlines since the beginning. She'd been the one who'd referred me to Patricia. But I told her the full story now, including Randy's visit to the porch and the settlement offer. She sat with it for a moment, then said, "Tom would be proud of you, and also furious, mostly proud." I laughed for the first time in weeks. Real laughter. Not the polite social kind, but the involuntary kind that comes from somewhere honest. It surprised me. The support of those 2 women, my daughter and my oldest friend, did something for me that I hadn't expected. It wasn't just emotional comfort, though it was that. It was calibration. It reminded me that my sense of what had happened and what should happen next was not distorted by grief or obsession or vindictiveness. I had been wronged. I was pursuing legitimate redress. That was clear and sane and right. Randy did not call, did not write. Through his attorney, there was silence after my rejection of the settlement, but I had the sense, in those weeks of quiet, of something waiting, of someone watching, of gears turning behind a door I couldn't see through. Detective Keyes called me twice during that period. Once to tell me the investigation had been referred to the county prosecutor's office for charging, and once to ask a clarifying question about the dates of the initial phone call. Each call was brief and professional and left me feeling steadier. Slowly, the machinery was doing its work. I just had to hold on. I tended my garden. I called Emma on Sundays. I had dinner with Marilyn on Thursdays. I learned in those weeks that patience is not passive, that waiting purposefully, maintaining yourself while a process plays out, requires more strength than action sometimes does. And underneath all of it, steady and unmoving, was the knowledge of what was coming. They came on a Sunday afternoon in early July, both of them this time. Randy and Diane pulling into my driveway in their silver SUV with a casserole dish and carefully arranged expressions of sorrow. I watched them from the bay window for a moment before I went to the door. I noticed that Randy had parked slightly crooked, the way he always did when he was nervous. Tom had teased him about it for decades. Some details stay with you. Diane had made a chicken dish. She was holding it out toward me as I opened the door, as though food were a password. She looked the way she always looked, polished, controlled, her silver blonde hair smooth and her clothes pressed. But there was something effortful about it today, a tightness around her eyes that told me she hadn't been sleeping well. Good. Helen, Randy said. He had his hat in his hand. Literally, his baseball cap held over his chest like he was at a funeral. We came to apologize, properly, not through lawyers. I looked at them both for a moment, then stepped aside and let them in. I didn't offer coffee. I didn't sit. I stood in the kitchen doorway and I waited. Diane set the casserole on the counter and looked around the kitchen with the particular attention of someone cataloging a space they believed they understood. Her eyes moved over the bay window, the filing cabinet in the hallway, Tom's armchair visible through the doorway to the living room. I watched her do it, and I said nothing. "We've been thinking about you so much," she said, and her voice had that careful warmth in it, the warmth that I recognize now for what it was. Performance. "You've been through so much losing Tom, and then this whole mess on top of it. We never wanted any of this. You never wanted me to find out," I said. Randy's jaw tightened. "We made a mistake," he said. "A terrible mistake, and we're ashamed of it. But Helen, Tom would not have wanted this. He would not have wanted his family torn apart over money. He would have wanted us to handle it quietly, between family." There it was, the invocation of Tom, the suggestion that pursuing accountability was somehow a betrayal of Tom's memory, rather than a defense of what Tom had built for me. I had expected this argument, and I had thought carefully about how to answer it. "You don't get to tell me what Tom would have wanted," I said. "You lost that right when you created a fake company to steal from his widow." Diane's composure cracked slightly. "Steal is a very ugly word," she said. "We were under financial pressure that year. You have no idea what we were—" "I don't need to know," I said. "Your reasons aren't my responsibility. What you did is documented. The county prosecutor's office has the file. I didn't put it there, you did. When you set up the LLC, when you made the phone call, when you cashed the transfers." Randy stepped forward slightly, not threatening or trying not to appear threatening, but moving into the space between us in a way that was meant to assert something. "Helen, if this goes to trial, Things about Tom's financial history will come out that could affect the estate, your inheritance, things I haven't told you yet." I had heard a version of this on the porch, but this time it was more specific, more pointed, and I noticed that Diane did not look surprised by it. They had planned this. They had come here with the casserole and the baseball cap and the apology, and underneath it was this, the same threat Randy had made on the porch, delivered now with greater precision. The food, the sorrow, the invocation of Tom, all of it had been scaffolding around this single moment. I had known it was coming, and still it landed with a specific, cold ugliness. I looked at the casserole dish sitting on my counter. I thought about the Cancun vacation. I thought about the coffee I'd been buying from Vermont because I couldn't bring myself to stop ordering it, the dental checkup I'd skipped because $500 a month had made my budget tight. I thought about the nights I'd sat in Tom's armchair at 2 a.m, not sleeping, not watching television, just enduring. And I thought about Randy's voice on that first phone call, David Harlow from Horizon Property Management, smooth and professional and utterly false. I took a breath. I held it. I thought, Patricia told me to document everything. "This conversation is being recorded," I said. That was not entirely true. I had started the voice memo on my phone when I saw their car pull in, a precaution Patricia had suggested I be prepared to take. "I'd suggest you think carefully about what you say next." The silence that followed was extraordinary. I watched it move across Randy's face first. The calculation, the reconsideration, the anger at having been outmaneuvered, then across Diane's where it looked more like fear. "We should go," Diane said quietly. Randy held my gaze for a moment longer. I held it back. Whatever he was looking for, hesitation, softness, a crack, he didn't find it. They took their casserole and left. I closed the door and leaned against it, and I noticed that my hands were trembling slightly. Not from fear exactly, or not only from fear. It was the particular trembling that comes from holding steady under pressure, the body releasing what the mind has been containing. I let it pass. I made tea. I sat at the bay window. Was I frightened? Yes, honestly. Randy was not unintelligent. The threat about Tom's finances was vague enough to be unprovable, but specific enough to plant doubt. I didn't know what he had or what he thought he had, and not knowing was uncomfortable. But I had learned something in the last few months. Discomfort was not the same as danger. Fear was not the same as reason to stop. I called Patricia and sent her the audio file. She listened to it, called me back 20 minutes later, and said the phrase, implied threat, and additional documentation, and "This is genuinely helpful, Helen." Good, I thought. Good. The hearing was set for a Thursday in September in a small, efficiently organized room in the Franklin County Courthouse. I had driven downtown alone, which I had decided deliberately. Emma had offered to come, had offered twice and then a third time on the phone the night before, and I had told her no, not because I didn't want her there, but because I needed to walk into that room as myself, not as someone who needed accompanying. There was a distinction that mattered to me. Randy and Diane both came. Randy's defense attorney, a man named Hargrove with expensive shoes and a clipboard, sat beside him with the look of someone who had assessed the case and was quietly managing expectations downward. Randy himself was in a dark suit, and he sat very straight, with the rigid, deliberate posture of a man working hard to look like nothing was wrong. Patricia sat next to me. She had her leather notebook and her reading glasses, and an absolute stillness about her that I had come to find deeply reassuring. Before the proceedings began, she leaned slightly toward me and said quietly, "Let the evidence do the talking today." It will." I nodded. I already knew. The prosecutor, a compact, focused man named Michael Tran, walked through the evidence in a sequence that I had come to know as well as my own address. The LLC registration 2 months after Tom's death, the phone call, the letters, the wire transfers, the bank records tracing every dollar through Carter Property Solutions, LLC, into Randy and Diane's joint account. He presented it without drama, without flourish, in the steady tone of someone who knows that facts, properly arranged, speak for themselves. I watched the jurors as Tran spoke. There were 8 of them: a retired teacher, a nurse, a young man in a plaid shirt, a woman who kept a careful notepad and wrote things down in small, precise handwriting. I watched their faces change as the timeline emerged. The LLC formed 2 months after the funeral, the different company name used on the phone call, the money flowing into a personal account. I watched their expressions move from neutral attention to something more focused, more concentrated, the way people look when something is becoming unmistakably clear. Hargrove's strategy, when it came, rested on 2 pillars. The first was intent. Randy had intended to formalize a real contribution to property management expenses that Tom had verbally agreed to before his death. An informal arrangement, improperly implemented, not a fraud. The second was competency. I had been in a vulnerable emotional state following Tom's death, had signed off on transfers without proper review, and could not be fully certain of what I had or hadn't been told. I sat very still during this portion of the proceeding, and I let Patricia's stillness anchor mine. The suggestion that my grief had made me unreliable, that my confusion was somehow relevant to whether a crime had been committed. I had expected it, and I had prepared for it. I breathed steadily. I looked at the middle distance. I waited. Then Prosecutor Tran began his cross-examination. "Mr. Carter," he said, "can you provide any written record, any text, email, voicemail, or document of the verbal agreement you claim your brother made with you regarding property management contributions?" Randy said he could not. "Can you explain why Carter Property Solutions LLC was registered specifically 2 months after your brother's death, rather than during his lifetime, if this arrangement predated his death?" Randy said the timing was unfortunate, but coincidental. The receiving account for these transfers, your personal joint account with your wife, is that a typical account for a property management LLC to use as its primary financial vehicle? Randy's attorney interjected. Tran moved on. "Mr. Carter, in 24 months of collecting these transfers, did you ever provide Mrs. Carter with a receipt, an invoice, any written accounting of services rendered on her behalf?" Randy said there had been an informal understanding. "An informal understanding," Tran repeated, and wrote something on his notepad without looking up. The pause that followed was perfectly calibrated. He let the words sit in the room until everyone in it had fully appreciated their weight. It was during Diane's testimony that things came apart. She had been composed in her seat for the first hour of proceedings, composed in the way of someone who has rehearsed composure. But under cross-examination, when Tran asked her specifically about the Horizon Property Management name, the name used in the initial phone call, which was different from the registered company name, she hesitated. "Can you explain why your husband's company was introduced to Mrs. Carter as Horizon Property Management rather than Carter Property Solutions?" Tran asked. Diane looked at Randy. It was a small movement, less than a second, but it was there, and it was visible, and it said everything that her words were trying not to say. Every person in that room saw it. The juror with the notepad wrote something down. "I'm not sure I understand the question," she said. "The question is straightforward," Tran said. "If this was a legitimate family property arrangement, why did the caller use a different name for the company than the one that was actually registered to receive the funds?" Randy leaned toward his attorney. There was a brief, whispered exchange. Hargrove stood and said something about the relevance of the question. The judge, a measured, unhurried woman named Judge Patricia Norris, overruled it without visible emotion. Diane said, "I think Randy was trying to... He thought it would be more professional sounding, more neutral." "More neutral than your own family name?" Tran said. The silence in the room was very complete. I looked at Randy, and for the first time in this entire process, I saw something in him that I recognized as the truth. He was scared. Not performing, not calculating, not managing, actually scared. His face had lost some essential certainty that I think he'd carried into this room believing he could hold on to. He was looking at the table in front of him, not at the judge, not at the jury, not at me, just at the table. And I thought of every morning he had known what he was doing while I sat at my bay window believing myself to be a responsible tenant in my own home. I thought of the Tuesday I had sat at the kitchen table with the bank statements and the yellow legal pad. I thought of the morning I had driven to the bank with the folder on the passenger seat. I thought of every small, deliberate step between that moment and this one. I thought, I did this. Not angrily, not triumphantly, just with a quiet and absolute clarity. Patricia placed her hand briefly on my arm, a small, steady gesture of acknowledgement, and I looked straight ahead and I let the proceedings continue. The verdict came 6 weeks after the hearing, on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Randy was found guilty of theft by deception, a third-degree felony under Ohio law, and wire fraud. The prosecution had presented, and the court had accepted, that Carter Property Solutions, LLC, had been established specifically for the purpose of defrauding me, that the Horizon Property Management framing had been a deliberate misdirection, and that there had been no legitimate basis for any of the payments I had made. Randy was ordered to pay full restitution of $12,000, plus $3,000 in accumulated interest and damages, plus my legal fees. He was sentenced to 18 months probation with community service. As part of the sentencing, Carter Property Solutions, LLC was dissolved and its registration voided. I watched Randy's face when the judge read the verdict. He had worn a dark suit and a careful expression all morning, the kind of expression that says, I am a reasonable man in an unreasonable situation. When Judge Norris said the word guilty, that expression simply fell apart. Not dramatically, not in pieces, but all at once, the way a held breath releases. He looked for just a moment like a man who had genuinely believed he might get away with it and had just learned otherwise. I had wondered during the long months of the process whether I would feel something sharp and satisfying at that moment. What I actually felt was quieter than that, closer to completion than to victory. Diane sat behind him in the gallery. She did not look at me once during the entire proceeding. I noticed that. I noticed also that she was alone, no friends, no family beside her, and that she sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed somewhere on the middle distance, the way people sit when they are trying very hard not to feel what they are feeling. The thing about Tom's finances that Randy had threatened to expose, the vague implication that had been meant to frighten me into silence, turned out to be nothing. His attorney had raised it in a pre-trial motion, and when the court asked for specifics, none materialized. There had been nothing. It had been, as I had suspected and Patricia had confirmed, a bluff. Randy had bet that my fear of uncertainty would be stronger than my commitment to the truth. He had been wrong. I walked out of the courthouse on that Tuesday morning into September sunlight, and Marilyn was waiting for me on the front steps with coffee from the place Tom had liked, which she had gone out of her way to get. And Emma had driven down the night before and was waiting by my car. I stood between them for a moment, the folder with the final judgment in my hand, and I thought about the Tuesday morning 2 years earlier when I had done the math at the kitchen table for the first time. $12,000, 24 months, $500 a month. The bank was cutting me a restitution check that would arrive within 30 days. Randy had already made the first payment. The court had required it before sentencing, and it had cleared that morning. I had checked my account at 6 a.m., standing in my kitchen in the quiet, and watched the number change. Patricia shook my hand outside the courthouse doors. It was a firm, brief handshake, and she looked at me with the particular expression of a person who has seen many cases and does not give that look easily. "You held up well," she said, "better than most." I thanked her, and meant it more than the words could carry. What I felt was not triumph, exactly, or not only triumph. What I felt, primarily and most completely, was the particular relief of a weight I had been carrying so long I'd stopped noticing its full measure finally being set down. I had been carrying something since the morning after Tom's funeral, a combination of grief and confusion and a sense of having been diminished, reduced, made smaller. And now, in this September sun, with my daughter beside me and my friend handing me coffee, that weight was gone. "How do you feel?" Emma asked. "Like myself," I said. She leaned into me and I put my arm around her, and we stood there for a moment before walking to the car. There was one thing I had not expected, and it was this. I felt no anger toward Randy. Not anymore. I had felt anger. Real, legitimate, clarifying anger in the early weeks and months. But somewhere in the process of taking action, of converting grief and fury into documentation and testimony and patience, the anger had spent itself. What remained was something simpler. I had been wronged. I had responded. The legal system, imperfect as it is, had functioned. Justice, in a real and documented and court-ordered sense, had occurred. Randy had made his choices. Now he would live with their consequences. I had made mine. I would live with them, too. The restitution check came on a Thursday. I deposited it and then sat in the parking lot for a few minutes before driving home, not doing anything in particular, just sitting with it. Then I drove to Marilyn's, and we opened a bottle of wine she'd been saving for an occasion that deserved it, and we sat in her backyard until dark. In the months that followed, I found that the house felt different. I had always loved it. The bay window, the backyard, the smell of coffee in the morning. But there had been a shadow over it in those 2 years of payments, a subtle wrongness I hadn't been able to name because I hadn't understood its source. That shadow was gone now. I stood at the bay window in the mornings with my coffee and thought, this is mine. Fully, legally, completely mine. It sounds like a small thing to say out loud. It did not feel small. I replaced the front door lock that autumn. I repainted the porch railing a deep charcoal gray. Small things, but each one felt like a declaration. I am the owner here. I am the one who decides. I started a small home staging consultation business that winter, helping people prepare houses for sale. It grew steadily through word of mouth, and by the following spring, I had a handful of regular clients and work I genuinely looked forward to. There was something deeply satisfying about walking into a house and seeing, clearly and immediately, how to make it feel like what it already wanted to be. Emma came down for Thanksgiving and stayed through the weekend. She brought her boyfriend, James, a quiet and careful man who asked thoughtful questions and helped with the dishes without being asked. We repainted the guest room a deep sage green that we both agreed Tom would have found alarming but would have pretended to like. Marilyn and I started taking long weekend trips, state parks, small towns, and once, in July, a long weekend on Lake Erie where we rented a cottage and did more or less nothing for 3 days. I had forgotten what simple pleasure felt like. It was extraordinarily good to remember it. I thought about Tom often, with love and without the sharp edge the grief had once carried. I kept his coffee order, his armchair, the framed photo on the hallway table, but I had also begun carefully to rearrange some things, not to erase him, but to make the house more fully my own, as well as his. As for Randy and Diane, Randy lost his management job 4 months after sentencing when a background check surfaced the felony conviction. He was, last I heard, doing part-time work in property maintenance. Diane filed for divorce 8 months after the verdict. In the divorce proceedings, financial records emerged suggesting she had known considerably more than she'd testified to. The cousin said she seemed diminished. I held that word and then set it down. I did not feel satisfaction about any of this. I want to be precise about that. What I had wanted was accountability, and I had gotten it. The natural consequences that followed were theirs, not mine to celebrate or to mourn. What I felt when I thought about all of it was this. I had been a woman in grief, and someone had tried to use that grief to diminish me, to take from me, to redefine me as someone easy to deceive, and I had refused. Step by step, document by document, day by patient day, I had refused. Tom had called me stubborn with great affection about once a week for 28 years. I think he would have been proud. People ask me what I would tell a woman in that situation, grieving, confused, being asked to sign things and transfer money while she can barely remember to eat. I tell her, write everything down. Trust the discomfort. Get a lawyer who is not recommended by the person you're uncertain about. Grief clouds judgment, but it doesn't erase instinct. And you are never too sad, too alone, or too overwhelmed to fight back. The system is slow and imperfect, but it can work. Evidence matters. Patience matters. You matter. Tom left me a house. Someone tried to take it from me while I was at my most vulnerable. I got it back. What would you have done in my place?